was a cheater. I started reading the Bible cover to cover when I was just a little boy, but I cheated. Every time I would come to those listings of family names, I would say, they started having kids here and they ended up having kids over there, and then I would resume. In other words, I would skip all the names. Because, when you're 12 years old, you don't want to have names like this to try to pronounce. They're hard to pronounce. We don't have any easy names. They're hard names. God does not put into His Bible anything that is throwaway. Everything that God has placed in His Bible is important. What we've looked at so far is we looked at the descendants of Japheth, and we've looked at the descendants of Ham. Now, we're going to look today at the descendants of Shem. And through Shem, we're going to have the messianic lineage. We can trace Jesus through this line. In fact, that's what Luke does. Luke goes all the way back to Adam, So we're going to be looking closely at this. So why did we spend a couple of classes looking at Japheth and Ham if the messianic line does not come through Japheth and Ham? Because I wanted you to be aware of where all these nations came about. I wanted you to be aware of how all this came about. In a future lesson, we're going to break it down even more. We're going to talk about how all these languages came about. We're going to talk about clans and nations and eye color and all different things. But God included it so that we could do that, so that we would be aware of where these people came from. So that is important. Now, let's finish up study number 62. We'll be here just a moment, and then we'll look at study 63 and 64. Shem and his descendants, the Shemites. Let's look at Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10. Let's look at verse number 21. And children were born also to Shem. Don't miss what it says here. The father of all the children of Eber. Okay? Now, if you look at the family tree, Eber is not Shem's son. So why does Moses phrase it like that? He says, Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Because Eber's part of the family tree is what's important. You've heard the word Hebrew, Hebrew language, the Hebrew people. Where do we get that word? You're looking at it. The word Eber, that man Eber, his name gives rise to that word Hebrew. That's how we get the word Hebrew. Through Eber, we're going to have that line that will eventually give us Jesus. And children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder. Japheth was the older one. Now, in some of your translations, we got a little problem. In some of your translations, you may look at verse 21, and it may look like it means that Shem was the youngest of the three sons. That is a weak translation of this phrase right here. The better translation is Japheth was the elder. He was the older one. Okay? He was the older son. Isn't it interesting that in the book of Genesis, Mankind likes to honor the oldest. How many here are the oldest in your family? By raise of hand. How many are the oldest? Okay, I see some hands going up. I hate to tell you this. In most cases in the book of Genesis, the oldest one wasn't the pick. Okay? Shem, not the oldest one. Okay? You think about Abraham, Isaac wasn't the oldest one. Jacob wasn't the oldest one. Joseph wasn't the oldest one. For all of us who are the young ones, we take a bow, okay? Because, hey, when our parents had perfection, they stopped having children. Okay? Now, this section begins by explaining that Shem was the father of all the children of Eber. The Messianic line would continue through their descendant. We're working up to Abraham. And once we get to Abraham will be near the end of chapter 11. And once we get to Abraham, we're going to camp out on Abraham quite a while. We're going to have a lot of chapters on Abraham because he's going to be an important guy. If the Jewish people had a Mount Rushmore, they would definitely have Abraham on that Mount Rushmore. They like to talk about Father Abraham. Of all of Abraham's ancestors, looking at all his ancestors, the two who lived the furthest time from the flood was Shem and Eber. Shem and Eber lived the longest in terms of distance from the flood. When we get to a story about a guy named Melchizedek, I'm going to give you some Hebrew history outside of the Bible about who Melchizedek actually was. Eber lived in the region that was eventually called the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. Eber is important. Let's continue on. Let's look at Shem's son. Let's look at some of his sons. His first son was Elam. He was the ancestor of the Elamites. Now, where did the Elamites live? Well, we know by looking at Jewish history that they lived east of Babylon in what was later called Persia. Today we call it Iran. Their primary capital was Susa. Remember in the story of Daniel, we got the capital Susa mentioned there in Daniel 8 verse 2. The Elamites created a 4-king coalition and captured Lot, the nephew of Abraham. Now, a lot of these clans, we would call them city-states. They have a large city, and the king would be in charge of that large city. Well, the Elamites created a 4-king coalition and captured Lot. But Abraham eventually defeated them. Genesis chapter 14. Now, let's look now at study number 63. Study number 63. Let's look at some more sons of Shem. Asher, Shem's son Asher. He was the ancestor of the Assyrians. Well, why would the Assyrians be important? Well, they were the ones that, remember, the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom, destroying the northern kingdom. Now, I need to mention, we've got 2 different Assyrian groups. These descendants of Shem, the Semitic Assyrians, they replaced the Hamitic, the descendants of Ham, those Assyrians, okay? Assyria later became a powerful empire noted for what? Extreme cruelty. His third son is going to be the seed son. Luke chapter 3, when Luke gives the family tree for Jesus, he mentions this guy. His name is spelled two different ways, but it's the same guy. In the account of this seed son, we have only the seed son, his direct seed son, mentioned. No other children are mentioned there with that. The narrative will quickly move all the way to Eber and Eber's two sons. Moses is concentrating now, he's got a mission. He's concentrating on the family tree for Jesus. We look at Eber's two sons, Peleg and Joktan. Peleg, Genesis 10:25. Genesis chapter 10:25. To Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. What does that mean? The earth was divided. Best guess. We're talking about what's going to happen in the next chapter. We're going to talk about what's going to happen at the Tower of Babel. The dividing of the languages. That's where the division comes up. Jotham, he's not part of the seed line. He had 13 sons. They're the founders of various Arabian tribes. The seed line of Peleg will be continued in the next Toledot. Let's continue. Sem had more sons, okay? We don't know a lot about these sons. Lud, we know very little. Even outside the Bible, Jewish history, very little. Man's history, very little. His son Aram and his four sons, they settled in what we would call today central Syria. Then look at verse 31. Look at verse 31 of chapter 10. It says, "These were the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages." Now, languages haven't been divided yet. That's not going to happen until chapter 11. So Moses is taking knowledge that will come to you in chapter 11, and he's applying it here in chapter 10. According to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, according to their nations. This section closes with the division of the Shemite nations. And from the Shemite nations, we get eventually the people we call the Jews. The Jewish nation. Semitic nation. Okay? Now, let's wrap up chapter 10. Verse 32. These were the families of the sons of Noah. Okay, we've just listed all the different families of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These were the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations in their nations, and from these the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. What happened with Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Shem, Ham, and Japheth outlived their children, okay? They outlived their grandchildren and even outlived many of their great-grandchildren. And in a couple of cases, even outlived their great-great-grandchildren, according to Jewish history. Why is that important to say? Because what will happen with all these different clans, they start putting a lot of special emphasis on Granddaddy Shem and Granddaddy Ham and Granddaddy Japheth. And in some cases, they even end up worshiping these people. Is that what God intended? No, it's not. But that's what man intended to do and did. Is family history important? Yes, it is. But God is more important, always. Now, before we continue with the study of what happens in chapter 11, and we're going to get that situation at the Tower of Babel, I want to share with you some Bible investigation questions that have come in that are dealing with Genesis. As I said, we've been getting a lot of questions. And this study on Sunday morning and Wednesday has generated a lot of questions. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at these questions that have come in dealing with Genesis. And on Bible investigation, we try to answer each question in 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm going to try to answer each one of these questions in 5 to 7 minutes. Get ready to start taking some notes. Question 1. Didn't Noah have 120 years to build the ark? Look at Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. And the Lord said, okay, God is kind of talking to himself here. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. Was God surprised at what was happening? No. Was God surprised what happened, say, 50 years from this point? Or 75 years from this point? Or in this case, 120 years from this point? No, God is not surprised. It says, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. The word there is where we get the word carnal. Carnal. Yet his days shall be 120 years. Does that mean that man only lived up to 120 years and then died? Well, no. I can give you many examples of people after Genesis 6:3 that lived longer than 120 years. Okay? So it's not talking about that. Is it talking about when Noah would start building the ark? Well, we know that Noah was 500 years old when he started having sons. And Japheth was born, and look at Genesis chapter 5, verse 32. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, he was 500 when Japheth was born. We know also in Genesis 7, verse 6, let's turn to Genesis 7, verse 6. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. Genesis 6, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So Noah was 600 when the flood started. But keep in mind, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were old enough to have wives. So Japheth was born when Ham was 500. Give, say, 30 years or so to get all those guys, eventually married. And then you have the rest of that up to 600, when Noah turned 600, for them to build the ark. So the ark, we would guess, probably took about 70 years, give or take, say 10, probably take away probably 10, to build it. So Noah did not have 120 years to build the ark. Look at question 2. What does it mean by the window of the ark? Genesis 6, verse 16. Let's look at that verse. You shall make a window for the ark. You shall finish it to a cubit from above and set the door of the ark in its side. Does that mean that the ark, that big, massive boat, had just a little window? No. This word here, this word that is used, is a very unique word in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word is toshbar. Toshbar. T-S-O-B-A-R is how we would spell it. That word is only used here. Later, when Noah opens up the window and lets the birds out to test, that's a different word. That word, toshbar, actually means light. Let me read to you from the American Standard Version, verse 16 of chapter 6. And light, a light shall thou make to the ark. That's the literal meaning of the word. So what's happening here? If we had just one little window, we wouldn't have enough ventilation. We got a lot of body heat from the animals. We're going to have a lot of heat generated inside that ark. We need ventilation. What that window is, it's a window that went around, most likely, the entire circumference of the ark. In other words, you've got the ark, you've got kind of I'm going to call it like a separate little roof on top, and underneath that roof was a window that went around the entire ark to create ventilation and to create, proper airflow. So this window is probably a window that goes around the entire ark. Okay? Now keep in mind, if you've got questions, text me and we'll get to your questions in just a moment. Question 3, how? How did Noah know which animals were clean or unclean, since that did not come into effect until Moses? Let's look at verse 19 of chapter 6. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. So how did Noah know what was clean and unclean? It is true that the official law concerning clean and unclean animals did not officially come into being until the Mosaical law. But that doesn't mean that God's people were not aware before. For example, look at worship, sacrificing. We have in the Mosaical law, we have all those rules about how to sacrifice and what is proper and what's improper and how you do it and all of that. Did they not sacrifice before the Mosaical law? Yeah, they did. Well, how did they know? Well, God had somehow talked to the patriarchs and had explained what He expected. Go all the way back to who? Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel were sacrificing. Well, how in the world did you know how to sacrifice? Cain, Abel. How do you know what would please God? Somehow God had informed them. Somehow Noah knew the difference between clean and unclean animals. Now, true, it doesn't officially come in until the Mosaical law. So those dietary restrictions don't take place officially until the Mosaical law. Now, what's the Mosaical law doing? It's creating a separate nation. It's saying, I want my people different from the world. I want my people a step above. I want my people better than the people around them. And here's how you do it. We're going to set up ways to make you special. And one of those ways was their dietary laws. Question number 4. This is how we do it Monday through Saturday on Bible Investigation. Question 4. Why wasn't God happy with His creation? This question actually came, I am blessed to have bivocational preachers in India, Philippines, and Africa that I work with every week. And this question actually comes from the guy in Africa, in Nigeria. He had a question about Genesis 6, verse 6. Here's what it says. And the Lord was sorry that He had made man on the earth, and He was grieved in His heart. The guy said, well, Michael, why wasn't God happy? Remember back when He made everything, creation week? That's good, that's good, that's good, that's good. And then overall, it's very good. What God created was perfection. Man came in and messed it up, caused problems. Why doesn't God want us to kill each other? Because the sanctity of life. It's wrong. You're taking a life that was created in God's own image. You see, man had perverted perfection and had changed it. And God looked over everything. And how many people were alive then? We don't know. But we would say, by looking at the math, that just by looking at the math, we've got thousands and thousands of people living in Genesis 6. Now, can I give you an exact census? No. Okay, we don't have an exact census. But I'm going to say to you, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of people living. Only 8 righteous people out of thousands. That's not very good at all. God was unhappy that His creation was destroying what He'd given them. Think about our children and grandchildren. We're proud of them, and rightly so. How do we feel when they misbehave? How do we feel when they do wrong? Are we proud of them? No. We're not proud of them. We want them to know we don't agree with you. As our children go older and they become adults, I have a friend who had identical twin sons. Now, as you know, with twins, if they are identical, that means one egg split in two. And you basically got the same personality, the same person twice, essentially. One son became a leader in the church. Even today, he serves an elder. Wonderful man. The other son has been in and out of jail more times than they can count. His parents are now deceased. Those twins' parents are now deceased. But in having a conversation with the mom, she would always talk about, what the good son was doing, and she'd always grieve over what the bad son was doing. It didn't make her happy what her son was doing that was wrong. Both sons were raised the same. Both sons were basically the same personalities. What happened? The Christian son married a wonderful Christian gal. The other son married a knockout beauty queen gal. That was evil. Evil with a capital E. And she led him away from God. It really went back to who the boys married. Because I think they had basically the same upbringing. In fact, I'm 99% sure they had the same upbringing. But one became good and one became bad. Question 5. What does water from the deep mean? Genesis 7. Genesis 7:17. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. Where does all this water come from? We go back to Genesis, it came from two sources. It came from the sky, okay? And we think that's the first rain. We're not 100% sure, but we think that was probably the first rain on the earth. And the water came from down below, spring water, coming from below. So what does water from the deep mean? It means the water that was underground. There was water underground. In my lifetime, they have discovered underneath the continent of Asia the largest mass of water ever discovered. It's way down deep, but it's there. God had provided. God was not surprised when mankind became so evil. And God had everything set up for what would transpire in the flood. So water from the deep means exactly that. It's water that's from underground water. Question 6. Okay, I love this question. Once again, this right here comes from a wife of one of our preachers I'm working with. Okay, she wanted to ask, was it 2? Was it 2 pairs? Was it 7? Or 7 pairs of animals on the ark? Now, we all know as children that, we have pairs coming on the ark, okay? But of the clean animals, we've got more. Because what did Noah do when he got off the ark? He immediately had what was probably the biggest sacrifice ever known to mankind. He sacrificed from every clean animal. He took a representative and sacrificed to God. Now, okay, we got at least 2 of all animals. And we're going to have more than 2 of the clean animals because we got to have enough for the sacrifice. So what is it? In the Hebrew language, I'll just tell you right now, it is confusing. Is it 7? Is it 7 of unclean? Is it 7 pairs of 7 clean? Was it 7 pairs of clean? Answer, we do not know for sure. Because the Hebrew is kind of confusing there. But here's the point. There were animals on the ark. All the animals we have today are descendants of those animals. Keep in mind, it says kinds. As I mentioned, all the dogs we have today, hey, we got a bunch of dogs, okay? We got a bunch of dogs in the world. They all come from what? 2 wolves. All the cattle today come from 2, a male and a female. So we have the kinds on the ark. But to tell you, was it 7 or 7 pairs, I don't know. Because the Hebrew there is very confusing. But does it really matter? No, it doesn't really matter, okay? So she wasn't really happy with me when I answered that question for her, but there it is. Question 7. What happened to the flood waters? Before the flood, we've got this massive, large continent. After the flood, we have all the earth movement, the plates moving, and we have the creation of separate continents. Did you know that there are points in the Pacific Ocean that if you were to reach the bottom, you would go down 7 miles. That's pretty deep, 7 miles down. Where did all the waters go? Well, we have the creation of all the great oceans. We have the mountains that spring up, that forces the water to go down. You know, God brings up the mountains, the water comes down. You know, God is the one that set in motion the water receding from the land, movement of land. Were the mountains we have today, were they in the same place as they are today? No. Were they as high as they are today? Not necessarily. You know, God was taking mountains, creating earth movement, and the water was running off. So we have the oceans, all the seas, the Mediterranean Sea. We have all those different large bodies of water that start collecting the water. God provided a way to take care of the floodwaters. God. It's God. How did all those oceans come about? Evolutionists? Well, we don't know. I mean, well, not for sure. Well, how did, you take a look at all the continents and you can kind of, like you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, you can see how all the continents kind of all fit back together. God tells us. We have the answers right there. Question 8. What is gopher wood? The ark was made out of something called gopher wood. What is that? Answer. We do not know for sure. We think, here's a guess, we think that gopher wood is somewhat similar to maybe cypress wood, perhaps. We're not for sure. We think it was a wood that was going to be good in floating for a year, because remember, we've got the flood, on the earth for actually, Noah went in and was in the ark for just over a year. So we think that the ark was made out of wood that would have been a good type of wood for a boat. In Cyprus, if you've seen pictures of Louisiana, cypress trees, growing out there in the middle of rivers, middle of streams, just right there in the middle of a stream. Cypress wood is a good wood to use with anything that's wet. So maybe the gopher wood was something like that, but we really don't know. We don't really know what gopher wood actually was. I'll tell you this, it was not made out of gophers, okay? Not made out of gophers. Question 9, how did Noah feed all the animals during the flood? Well, that's an interesting question. How did he feed all the animals, okay, thank you so much, during the flood? Now, remember when we started looking at the dimensions of the ark? We said that the animals would take up less than 50% of the dimensions of the ark. Less than 50%. And that's at a maximum. Remember, I gave you 2 figures, a low number and a bigger number. If the bigger number is true, the animals would take up just under 50%. If the smaller number is true, the number of animals on the ark, it would take up even less space. 2 points. If you're going to house a bunch of animals for about a year, do you want baby animals or full-grown adult animals? I want baby animals, smaller. Number 2, hibernation. My opinion, here's my opinion. My opinion, God calls these animals to all go into a hibernation. And they could basically sleep. Animals that still hibernate, they start and they hibernate all through winter, and, they don't eat. They don't wake up. I wake up hungry. Every day I wake up hungry. Animals sleep for weeks and weeks in hibernation without eating. So I think, in my opinion, here's just my opinion, that these animals, they were probably put in some kind of hibernation state. Now, we're going to look at some questions here. Okay. The example of the children and grandchildren worshiping their ancestors is similar to people today saying my grandparents' religion was good enough for them and it's good enough for me. Amen. I've heard people say, well, that's not the way my grandmother, that's not the way my grandfather worshiped. That was not the church that they chose. And, it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. I value my ancestors, but I've got to make my own decision about God. Let's see if we got anything else. That is it on questions. We're going to wrap this up on Wednesday night. We're going to, as I said, we're going to look at how all the races and languages, and I'm even going to talk about eye color coming up Wednesday and Sunday. We have the next lesson up here, ready for you to pick up. I'll eventually get it back there, put on the back for you to look at. I really do appreciate you all. You all are just wonderful. I love you all. You are dismissed. Thank you.